traditionally we think of people with health conditions being in their 50s and getting into the older population, as does tend to happen, that people's health broadly does tend to deteriorate as they get older. But we've really seen big growth in both on the benefits side and also in the wider working age population in mental health conditions. Across various different sources, you're seeing something like a doubling in the share of the population reporting or being diagnosed with a mental health condition over the last decade.
Hello, and welcome to IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. This week, we're looking at health-related benefits. The government recently announced what it described as, and I quote, the largest welfare reforms for a generation to help sick and disabled people who can and have the potential to work into jobs. Put more bluntly, the government is cutting health-related benefits and using a small portion of the savings to provide more help to find a job. And I think it's no surprise that the government is looking to rein in spending on health-related benefits when you look at the numbers. The amount we spend on these benefits has risen from around 30 billion in 2009 to almost 60 billion today. When Labour came into government, it was forecast to increase to around 70 billion by the end of the decade. To give you some context, that's more than we currently spend on transport, prisons, courts, police and border protection all combined. How we design support for those with disabilities is clearly an emotive and contentious issue, but I think the government would have been remiss not to take a hard look at the system and ask whether it is working. And today we're going to take a hard look at the system and the potential impact of the government reforms. To do this, I'm delighted to be joined by David Finch, who is an Assistant Director at the Health Foundation, where he leads a programme of work looking at the role of social and economic policy in improving health, and by our very own Tom Waters, who is an Associate Director here at the IFS and leads our work on income, work and welfare. So welcome to both of you. I think it's worth laying the foundations of this discussion by setting out really exactly what health-related benefits are. So Tom, can you kick us off with a primer?
Okay, so we have two broad kinds of health-related benefits in the UK, usually referred to as disability benefits and incapacity benefits. So disability benefits are those to support people whose health condition increases their cost of living. You might think that perhaps if you're unable to get around, you need to take public transport more, or perhaps you need to have people help you to prepare meals if you're unable to do that. Those disability benefits, the main one for working age people is called Personal Independence Payment, or PIP. And then incapacity benefits are those targeted at people whose condition prevents them from working. And so that's mainly supplied now through universal credit, the main means tested benefit in the UK, with a health element of it targeted at those whose condition stops them from working.
And for those of us who haven't interacted with the system, I mean, roughly how much support are they providing to the people who are getting them? What kind of sums are involved here?
So it can vary quite a lot, especially disability benefits, but both incapacity and disability, on average, people get about £7,000 or £8,000 a year from either one or the other. Some people will get both. They'll get larger amounts, but the average receipt is about £7,000 or £8,000 from each.
So these are non-trivial. These are substantial benefits for the people getting them. And David, can you fill us in on the kinds of health issues that these benefits are supporting and the kinds of people that are getting them?
I mean, across both benefits, the ones that make up the majority are either mental health disorders or psychiatric disorders and musculoskeletal diseases. In PIP, we tend to get the main primary condition reported. And around 40% of those are psychiatric disorders, and around 30% are some form of musculoskeletal disease. But we think from other survey data, it's likely that the vast majority also have a mental health condition, and also that people have more than one condition. On the more incapacity benefit side, around 2/3 of those are mental or behavioural disorders, but they don't list quite the same way in the primary condition. So also around 45% of a musculoskeletal disease, but there's some overlap in those. And they really do tend to broadly reflect the types of conditions in the wider population, and particularly the shift towards more mental health conditions over more physical conditions, where we've seen really big rises in mental health conditions in the working age population over recent years.
I think that might surprise some people. I think when you hear disability benefits, you might kind of immediately think about people who need support with their mobility, people who have physical disabilities. But I think what you're saying is that mostly it's not that. It's a lot of mental health related issues. And that's been a big part of the growth. Is that right?
Yeah, and also across different ages as well. I think traditionally we think of people with health conditions being in their 50s and getting into the older population, as does tend to happen, that people's health broadly does tend to deteriorate as they get older. But we've really seen big growth in both on the benefits side and also in the wider working age population in mental health conditions. Although the data isn't perfect on these, we'll probably talk about that a little bit. But across various different sources, you're seeing something like a doubling in the share of the population reporting or being diagnosed with a mental health condition over the last decade.
I was going to ask about the data. So I mentioned at the top, we've seen this massive rise in the amount spent on these benefits, a rise in the underlying number of claimants. What do we know from data about the kind of underlying population's health? Is it just a reflection that the population is getting sicker?
I think broadly across data, it does point towards a deterioration in health. Probably the kind of most unbiased place to look is things like life expectancy and mortality rates, where there was a kind of slowdown in life expectancy improvements before the pandemic. We're now seeing higher mortality rates in the working age population since the pandemic. So those things do point towards something quite acutely wrong in people's health. Across the survey data, often that's self-reported and or can be a mix of tests that are, again, they're self-reported, but they're tests to understand kind of the extent to people's, say, psychological distress. And then we also have some data linked to kind of GP records, and so diagnosis and prescriptions. And those do all point towards higher prevalence. I think the question is whether that was there already and people are now more aware of it. There's a big increase in kind of diagnosis and awareness around mental health conditions. So it's quite hard to know if there's actually a underlying deterioration there, or to what extent it's an underlying deterioration, and to what extent it is that we're just more aware of what may have been poor mental health in the past.
And do we know, perhaps I'll ask you this, Tom, do we know how the UK compares here to other countries? Because on the face of it, this is pretty depressing, right? People are getting more unwell, or at least we're revealing that they were more unwell than we thought they were.
Yeah.
Is the UK an outlier here? What do we know about other countries?
Certainly when we look at the number of people getting these benefits, the UK has been an outlier in the change. I think this is quite an important subtlety to draw on a bit. There's been a big increase in the number of people getting these benefits since the pandemic in the UK. That hasn't been seen in other countries. But if we look at like the total amount that the UK spends on these sorts of benefits as a share of GDP, a share of our national income, the UK's level is kind of middle of the pack amongst higher income countries, like OECD countries. So we'd certainly, the trajectory, the UK definitely stands out, but actually where we are right now isn't that unusual. Of course, if things keep on going in this trajectory, the UK will end up near the top of the pile. But, we spend sort of on the order of 2% on these benefits, and that's not unusual by international standards.
And if we just ignored the sort of benefits part of it, because obviously there are lots of reasons why countries will differ in the kind of benefits they offer and who can claim the benefits. Thinking about the underlying health trends, can we say anything about whether people in the UK are having more problems with mental health, for example? Are we a sicker nation?
The kind of easier measures to compare against are things like life expectancy. We don't do that well against the rest of the OECD, especially for women on life expectancy. And in the period before the pandemic, so the kind of the decade before, there was across most sort of comparable peer countries, there was a slowdown in improvements in life expectancy. But the UK was almost unique in having one of the slowest or the fastest slowdowns as such in that. And the other comparable country was kind of the US, which has also, there's obviously documented there around big rises in sort of deaths of despair in the US as well, which is something we tend to see here, and particularly concentrated in places, more deprived areas and places like in the northeast and in parts of Scotland as well.
Actually, it's worth picking up on that, isn't it? That I've asked about cross countries, but actually there's a huge variation within the UK. So certain parts of the UK are getting higher benefits, having higher prevalence of health issues. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, exactly. A very, very large amount of variation. So some parts of the country, if you look in like Merthyr Tydfil in Wales or Blackpool, you're getting on for 1 in 5 working age people are on one of these benefits.
1 in 5.
Whereas, you go to generally a much richer part of the country, it's more like 3% or something.
1 in 5.
Yeah.
That's huge, isn't it?
Yeah. And it very much reflects the kind of patterns of underlying health as well, where those areas will have been the worst for health in the decade before or 2 decades before. So it's really quite deep-seated and structural. And I think particularly when you're thinking about some of the labour market impact, you tend to have, say, a woman around, I think in their 50s will tend to have the kind of health of someone in their 70s between the sort of most and least deprived areas. So there's a really big impact on that kind of people starting to pick up multiple conditions at much younger ages in their 50s compared to above retirement age in other areas.
Can I ask about when you were talking about like the slowdown in life expectancy and the UK performing relatively poorly? Is it do we know like why the UK has been performing poorly? Or is this like one of the many things that's like black box?
I don't think we do. I mean, I always think there's an interesting parallel that you've had a kind of slowdown in productivity growth around a similar kind of period, probably started a bit before I know, and you can link things like health to, we do link health to our living standards and improvements in living standards. So you've had that really big drop off in kind of improving living standards since the financial crisis, and then a couple more crises along the way. But I do think the level of attention that the productivity growth slowdown has got is much greater than the level of attention that the slowdown in health gets. And it's not until we're potentially starting to see some of those consequences now that it's sort of starting to get more attention.
I'm getting into a little bit into the data weeds here, but sort of indulge me. You mentioned about obviously different areas have worse health in some areas. When we're seeing the growth in the problems, is it we're seeing areas that have historically had poor health getting even more poor health, or actually is the poor health spreading across the country?
I think probably to be quite negative about it, it's a bit of both, in that we're seeing worsening health across most areas, and we're seeing stronger growth, particularly kind of related back to inactivity or benefit claims in those more deprived areas. I mean, it's not always perfect relationship there, but that tends to be the broad trend.
So before we move on to policy, I feel like we should at least say something about fraud, because I suspect many people listening will have heard stories about, for example, TikTok videos where people seem to be trying to coach or encourage people to game the system. So I think a lot of people will be asking the question, is some of this growth to do with fraud and people getting the benefit that shouldn't be getting the benefit, that weren't the intended recipients of the benefit? What do we know about that? Maybe I'll come to you first, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult one. I mean, to know what David thinks as well. When you go to, say, be assessed for PIP, it's what's called a functional assessment. It's, are you able to do certain kinds of tasks with more or less difficulty? These kind of basic daily living tasks or getting about. Now, some of that, inevitably, there has to be a level of kind of relying on the claimant to provide some of that information, how easy or difficult they find to do different things. So that's different to, in the US, for example, their main disability benefit is less for functional assessment. It's more like, do you have a particular medical condition? And that will just be like verified by a doctor. Because we've got this more functional assessment, that kind of inevitably you have to have a bit more of a contribution from the person claiming to say how it affects their lives. And so, that could create like a scope for fraud. Does that mean that's actually going on a large scale? I don't think we've got any positive evidence to say it does. But I think it's just a very difficult thing to assess. How bad is someone's health? Well, for PIP claimants, we've got one assessment, which is the one that got them onto the benefit for them.
As we're saying, the assessment is quite specific, right? So they're asked about can you do very specific tasks? It's not just, do you have problems in your daily life? It's, do you have problems with, is that right?
Yeah.
Specific things.
Do you have problems preparing food? Do you have problems getting changed? Things like that. Do you have problems cleaning yourself? And the assessment, it takes into account medical information, but it's a kind of a combination of different factors. So I think it's hard to say. I don't think we've got any positive reason to think there's like loads of fraud going on, but I don't think we've also got like a really clear idea about exactly what the rate of fraud might be.
What's your take, David?
I mean, I think probably the big thing is it's like notoriously not a very pleasant experience to go through that test, and it's often linked to actually making people's health worse, just the process of going through it, or even being aware that it's about to happen.
Because of the stress of going through it.
Yeah, the stress from it. And I think some of the sort of, people can find it dehumanizing to have to explain what they can and can't do. And it's, it's quite a grueling thing. And then often it might be reassessed or it's appealed. And so it's quite a lengthy, difficult process. So I think it's quite hard to think in that respect, people are going to be kind of queuing up to go through it as such. But I suppose the one place where there is an assumption around it is in kind of OBR's assumptions around the changes to spend on disability benefits, and that they're partly attributing some of the dynamic response to changing these thresholds, that some people will adapt their responses and still be able to claim. I mean, I don't think they've said...
You think the upcoming reforms, that's what you're
upcoming reforms where potentially people... As you said, there's a subjective element to it of how they will, I suppose, express the evidence. But I don't know if that points towards people being fraudulent, or if that points towards a test that maybe could be better.
Always just like a bit vague, are you able to get yourself changed? And there's different levels of severity and how you can answer that. But like maybe on Monday you were relatively able to, and on Tuesday you were less able to, and maybe if you can do it, but with quite a lot of pain, it is just a bit vague. It is just, so that doesn't mean I would distinguish that from being fraudulent, where someone's like kind of intentionally misrepresenting things, but it is an element of subjectivity in the test.
Because let's come back to the kind of how kind of the OBR and the assumption-based reforms, and let's kind of talk about the policies. So before we get onto the specifics, I think it's worth talking about what the government's trying to achieve in some sense. So the Secretary for Work and Pensions, that's Liz Kendall, has spoken about a kind of broken welfare system and the need for wholesale reform. So I think it's worth dwelling on kind of what problems do the government see with the existing system. Obviously, I flagged the big increase in the price tag of the system. That's no doubt on politicians' minds. But you might also think about concern about, are the benefits targeting support to the right people? Are they providing the best form of support for the conditions that are arising? Are they keeping people out of work? So let's talk about what do we know about what the government thinks they are trying to achieve through reforms?
Yeah, I think the way the government's kind of thinking about it is the basic level of unemployment support you get in the UK. If you just lose your job, you don't have a health problem, and you go on to claiming, typically be universal credit, the basic level of support you get is, by international standards and actually also by historical UK standards, is quite low.
Tell us what the number is, because it really is quite low, right?
Yeah. So if like the sort of someone who doesn't have any children, they don't have any rent costs or anything like that, it's on the order of like £4,000 a year. And if you get a relatively low level of benefits, and perhaps that's, you might just think, how am I going to be able to live on this? If you've got a health condition, then that might encourage you to try and get on health-related benefits. And I think part of the way the government's thinking about it is kind of we're going to make it harder to qualify for these benefits. We're kind of bringing down the health-related benefit side. It's hard to qualify and you get less money. But also at the same time, we're going to try and bring up the basic unemployment support. So the basic level of universal credit is going up a bit, not loads. And they're also bringing in a new unemployment insurance scheme. So it'll be time limited. We don't know how long yet, but you'll get a higher level of benefits for, it'll probably be something like 6 months, I imagine, 6 months, maybe a year or something. And by doing that, closing that differential, that kind of reduces part of the incentive to get on health-related benefits and instead to, just be on out work benefits and then get back into work. I think that's part of what they think.
Okay. We'll come back in just a second to what they're actually doing. But I mean, David, from your point of view, is there a problem here that the government should be looking at and should be trying to solve?
Yeah, and I think I suppose it's the difference between what the government are doing and the underlying problems, perhaps, in that, it feels pretty clear that the cuts to the disability benefit side to PIP are a cost-saving exercise. I mean, they moved broadly in line with the scale of cut needed at the spring statement. So, and there's a bit of a contradiction in that they're planning to reassess and understand, is PIP fit for purpose, but they're doing that after the cuts being brought in, which I think reflects that there's a recognition that the things we're talking about, the changes in the working age population's health, probably aren't that well understood, and it's leading to this kind of increasing spend on disability benefits. And that's something I think that any government would need to get a grip of, even if it's just to actually make sure you're getting the right types of support to people to meet their need. And then you've also got, I think, again, the recognition that from the incapacity benefit side increasing, that's often been a bit of the benefit system that hasn't really met a goal of getting people back into work, even going right back to the kind of, I suppose it's late 70s type time when you started to get that shift across into longer term sickness benefits. And so I think it's, so there's elements of they're recognising some underlying longer term problems and trying to shift them, but also that kind of the fiscal goal is a bit of a driver of the more immediate changes coming through.
So let's dive into what they've actually done. So there's really quite a lot going on here, right? So maybe Tommy, talk through the high level. What are the main changes that they've announced to these two benefits that you set out right at the start? Yeah,
okay. So let's see if I can remember them all. So PIP, the disability benefit, they're going to make that harder to qualify for in a way that basically targets those who are have somewhat less severe disabilities.
My targets, you mean if you've got less severe disability, you'll stop being eligible.
You'll just get
But those who have the more severe disabilities will continue to be eligible.
Yeah, exactly. And they would typically, get the same amount as before. So it's sort of try to carve out that, like, the less severe portion of the caseload. Okay, that's one. Another one is for incapacity benefits, for those that are targeted for those who are unable to work. Just the amount that you get is going to be cut in half for new claimants. Third thing is they're going to introduce this unemployment insurance scheme, higher level of benefits when you first lose your job for a while. So yeah, as I said, maybe 6 months, maybe 12 months, something like that. Fourth thing is just the basic level of universal credit is going to be a little bit higher. And the fifth thing is going to be more kind of support for getting into work. So what they often call employment support. So things like training or help preparing a CV and things like that. It's going to be more support for people who've got health conditions. I think that's all of them.
Are they also changing what makes you eligible for the incapacity benefit?
Yes, that's a really important one. I forgot. Well done. Good.
Brownie points for me.
Good. Well done. Yes, exactly. So at the moment, we've got these two benefits. You're assessed for them separately. You can get one and not the other. There's plenty of people that get one and not the other. They're going to link them together. So if you get the disability benefit, if you get PIP, and you're on universal credit, you'll also get kind of what we used to think of as the incapacity benefit. So it's a little bit unusual in a way. It means that there won't be a benefit that's just targeted at those who are unable to work because of a health condition. That just sort of won't exist. Instead, you're going to have this benefit that's targeted at those who've got high cost of living because of their disability, but they'll get an extra amount as well if they're on universal credit.
And in a sense, that's the kind of big structural change here, right? So some of this is tweaking parameters. You make the health element of universal credit a bit less generous, or a lot less generous in some cases. PIP eligibility gets shaded back. But as you said, the kind of structural change here is that we'll no longer have these two separate benefits. There will no longer be a separate benefit for people with health conditions who are out of work. And we'll load more of it onto the personal independence payment. So if you get it now, you'll get this extra thing as well. So some people, they'll be better off because they're going to get two benefits.
Yeah.
But we're basically getting rid of two benefits.
Yeah, exactly. As you say, yeah, it's an important structural change really to the way in which we support people with health conditions. And I think, perhaps we'll go on to this, as part of what the government's thinking is that it breaks the link between getting one of these benefits and like being in work or being able to work. It's very much the nature of, if you don't have a benefit that's targeted at those who are unable to work. And so that, I think they hope that that's going to encourage employment. And
one upside there is that if you have one of these benefits, if you have a benefit and you go into work, you won't lose your benefit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, there's survey evidence which suggests that people who are on these benefits are really worried that if they get into work and then lose their job doesn't work out, they lose their job, then they'll be stuffed because then they won't have a job and they won't have their health-related benefits. They might have lost that. That's like a big concern people report, and this will perhaps help alleviate some of those concerns by breaking that link.
So there's lots going on, and there are going to be some winners and some losers. So it's not all losers. But David, let me come to you. I mean, taking that kind of package of changes as a whole, what kind of effects are you expecting to see from those changes?
I think, and it's interesting when we've talked about kind of taking some of the least severe out of eligibility of PIP, but it's something like actually would have been half of the population potentially eligible, or half of the claims or people claiming that would actually be could lose their eligibility. And then there's that big assumption by the OBR that half of those won't lose because of other factors, and it is the less severe, but it's not like shaving a small bit off. It's actually quite a substantial inroad into that population. It's quite so the scale of it is quite interesting in that it is something like there's things around 3 times the size of the cut that the previous government planned to make to the incapacity benefit side, which has been overturned in these reforms. And I mean,
just as a side note there, sorry, to pick up what you said earlier about the changing behavioural response and the OBR scoring. So I think I'm right in saying what's happening there is that it's really hard to know how people respond to this, in the sense that you might currently be filling in the assessment, and almost once you get to enough points and you're eligible, you stop worrying about, do you meet some other criteria? Maybe you didn't worry about how you could dress yourself if you've already got a mobility condition. Once the rules change, you might not put a fraud just because you now things are different. You might fill in the form differently. You might tell your assessor things differently. So we don't actually know how many people will be eligible under these new set of criteria. No,
I mean, I think that's definitely part of it, is that kind of uncertainty. And then I think the other two big things are, I suppose, I was going to say the success of reforms in this area in the past, which haven't been very successful. So that the original intention of PIP was to reduce spend, and it clearly hasn't been achieved, and just implementation timescales as well. So I think that a hefty dose of scepticism about when the savings would actually be realised, which is potentially making them then look bigger, or the cuts bigger, because to sort of achieve the the fiscal aim of those, of the shape of those.
So coming back to the what are we going to see when these reforms kick in, do you think?
Yeah. I think, especially if we're thinking about the incapacity benefit side, it is trying to address, I think, some long-held concerns with the way the system operates. And one of those is that people, as you start to leave work and because of sickness, you tend to not get a great deal of support from your employer. And then you can move into the benefit system, especially if your because statutory sick pay is such a low rate. You may already be in the benefit system, but there's not a great, I suppose, incentive for you to hang on to your employment at that point. And you may then start moving into the benefit system, and it can take several months, like 3-6 months, to get assessed. And then at that point, you may just about at the point where you're getting that kind of interaction with the system, if you're deemed unable to continue working, then actually you get no support at all. And so, which is that kind of binary system point that Tom was talking about earlier. And so you've kind of been left for a long time. And we know the longer that you're out of work, the harder it is to return. There's quite complex interactions between your health and whether you're in employment, which means both of those things, your employment chances can get worse and your health can deteriorate over the same time period. It means people are left for quite a long time without help. So I think that kind of divorcing of the bit of income going to support people because of their health over because they're going back to work is potentially a positive thing. I think the bit that's really hard stuck in the middle is that they're kind of there because you're worried about their employment chances. So you still need some kind of device to be thinking about what type of support do people need and can they and are they ready to be helped back into work? I mean, the current system's very harsh, effectively, and it's been one of the things that has been discussed as a possible reason why people are trying to move into the health element side, because you don't get that conditionality applied. And I suppose from a employment and people's health and wellbeing perspective, if you end up in a world in which maybe they're getting the payment, but they're still getting a lot of harsh conditionality that doesn't suit them, doesn't necessarily mean you get back to a high employment, good health workforce. I think it's something that it's going to be difficult to work on because it will come down to discretion effectively. And I think it's probably a kind of historic issue with people with health conditions. It's quite hard to target the need of people, particularly when you're then mixing it with employment barriers, because it's just a very complex sort of situation.
But the government is planning to use some of the money they've saved from the cuts, or they hope to save from the cuts, to have some kind of increased employment support. How much do we know about what they are planning to do there?
I think at the moment we know it will be up to £1 billion support by, I think it's about 2028, 29 maybe, that's coming in. So there's a slight issue in that support is kind of being ramped up after the cuts have been made. I suppose there's a lot of discussion about whether that employment support can offset the impact from the cuts to the disability benefits. But I think it's quite important to recognise that the disability benefits are fundamentally doing something different to supporting kind of employment outcomes. And potentially if they're there to help overcome things that increase people's disability effectively, then taking more money away from people may mean actually they're more unable to go and find work because they can't access the kind of support and services they needed. But I suppose in a positive sense, it's important to be getting that money into a group. I think it's often you don't get such a high employment return from people with longer term health conditions. So I suppose it's something, I think it's probably a bit of a reality check on how far you can actually get the substantial bulk of people who are already out of work back into work, and how much you need to focus on people who are sort of more at the point at which they're closer to leaving the labour market in the first place and trying to keep them back in, which can be much more sort of cost effective, but will take a longer time before you start to see the kind of impacts overall on employment.
I think as well with these sorts of programs is typically the governments all across the world have these sorts of employment support programs for people who are unemployed. Very common to have like training support, or help with CV or whatever. And we've got actually a pretty good evidence on how effective they are and what kinds of things work. But I think there's much less evidence on what works for people with health conditions. Is just, it historically hasn't been like the target group. It's been people unemployed that's been the target group. And so I think it's much harder for the government to really know what's going to work. If you look at the kinds of evidence we do have, which is kind of thin, our kind of back of the envelope is you'd probably expect people in like tens of thousands of people perhaps to be getting into work. That like order of magnitude, not hundreds of thousands.
It's relatively small, right?
It's small relative to the number of people going to be affected by the reform, which is going to be it depends how you count it, but it's going to be into the millions.
So it means people losing some kind of benefit
And then,
maybe tens
of thousands. Yeah,
to work.
Exactly. I think it's that. Yeah, exactly. Without putting like really precise numbers on it, that's like the right order of magnitude. Is substantial majority of people affected by this will just remain out of work, and will just have the income hit.
Yeah, of course. I think I'm right in saying too, there's some uncertainty here in part because we're talking about things that haven't happened yet in some sense.
Yeah.
We've got a rise in the expected benefits bill. So some of what we're talking here about is that people who haven't yet become eligible for a benefit, but who would in future become eligible under the old system, who will no longer become eligible and therefore will get a benefit they were never got in the first place. And of course, it's even harder to make statements about things that haven't even yet happened. But some of it we're talking about current claimants who will actually lose cash they're currently getting. And some of it is about people who will no longer be eligible for cash. And we don't know quite what it will do to their labour market, whether they leave a job or get a job. I think that's part of the uncertainty here, right?
When you look at, I suppose, past employment successes in the labour market, they haven't become because of one single change to the type of employment support they can get. It's tended to be because the whole ecosystem has started to shift a bit. So things like maternal employment, you go back to kind of more right to return to work. You've got better maternity pay. You've got kind of quite strong incentives, financial incentives or started to get strong financial incentives within the benefit system through tax credits and so on. And that did, as well as an identification of a point at which you thought it was more likely that a mum could return to work potentially. And that, I think, is that right combination over a couple of decades has led to quite a big shift in, and also childcare, but lots of childcare provision as well, has led to quite a shift. But I think when you look at the health side, you're at a point where you don't have a lot of those structures in place. And in fairness, I think things slightly push against that from happening in the current structures.
And so one thing I don't know much about, but you kind of touched on a bit earlier, is people who develop a health condition when they're in work and what can be done to kind of support them in work or help their employer support them in work, whatever. And so I think the government has this access to work scheme, which I think they're maybe even consulting on some changes for. Yeah. But I'd be interested to know, like, what do you make of kind of the current setup there? And
I think you have pockets of like good practice by employers, and there's definitely a lot of where we've spoken to employers, there's a lot of kind of recognition of health issues, and employers are investing in certain types of support. Often it seems that that's not necessarily effective. It's not been sort of tested or meeting certain standards. So things like some of the employer assistance schemes that are provided, it's questionable about some of them whether they're actually having a big positive impact. But I think so. There's a bit of kind of a better what works, and then employers understanding what they should be doing. But I think it's a kind of almost three stages to it. One is around just making sure the conditions people are working in are protective of health in the first place. There might be adjustments. It might be things like hazards. It might be job design and sort of flexibilities. But then as people's health starts to get worse, it's making sure actually you're acting quite quickly on it. And, if someone's absent from work, you have that kind of day one conversation with them when they come back to check, are they okay? And if they need any help. And then, if they're out of work for a week or something, you're then trying to get support in place instead of what can often be a kind of you leaving people for too long. And it's similar in the benefit system that you're not really, it's unemployment support. It's not stay in work support. Whereas something, I suppose, the furlough scheme is an example where you had some quite strong built-in employer attachment. It does seem to have been a bit protective of people's health and of employment over the period as well. So if you can kind of keep that labour market attachment in place, I think it could make quite a difference.
I think we're coming up towards the end of our time. So why don't we sort of wrap up by looking forward about kind of what the government should do next? I think we've banded about a number at some point in our talk about the government thinks it will save about $5 billion. I think I'm right in saying, Tom, that number might grow over time as more people come into the new system, but actually the overall benefits bill is still going up. So if we think about that 70 billion that I put on the horizon at the start, we're shading off a relatively small amount relative to that. Is that right? Yeah,
that's right. It slows the growth in spending rather than stopping it. Yeah.
So it's not the kind of the end of the conversation, I think, we'll see about health-related benefits. I mean, David, big picture, what would you like to see the government doing in this space?
I mean, I think there's probably a few elements to it. One, and I'll be brief though, one element is I think that kind of more proactive system. So if you're bothered about employment, I think you need to be much more extreme in trying to stop people falling out of work in the first place, and also kind of more protective of their health. I think there's a bit of a challenge of actually understanding what is happening to the health of the population, because I think the data we have on mental health isn't great. It's affecting people when they're very young, and that could have really big serious implications over the coming decades. So if we're not getting to grips with that now, could be quite an even bigger problem in the future. So that's why things like in the in the green paper about reassessing PIP or re-understanding, how PIP should be designed is actually quite a good idea, I think, to sort of get into a proper conversation about what are the needs of people and what do we need to support, rather than what tends to be, and making big cuts to benefits kind of reinforces it. It tends to be quite a cautious discussion and defensive discussion about protecting entitlements. And probably at a further level is a bit of recognition that we're in an aging society now. So, we'd expect some kind of growth in spend on these types of benefits as we're getting an older population, but it seems to be something we're not particularly prepared to pay for.
What do you think, Tom? What are you looking out for?
This makes me sound like an economist out of central casting, but I think especially on this employment support, as I said, I don't think we really have like great evidence on what works for people with health conditions. I think the government should be seriously thinking about running good trials where they're testing out different approaches and trying to figure out what works. And I think as well, it's worth thinking about. It is very easy for the conversation to be entirely about employment, but in reality, that's not like the only thing that matters. I think anyone would agree. Even economists think that. And so, employment has the advantage that it's kind of quite easy to measure and so on. But I think trying to when they're running these when they're doing these employment support programs, trying to think about a wider set of outcomes as well. What are the kinds of jobs people are getting into, even just that, but also what is it doing to people's well-being, things like that. I think all of those things would be good to think about, and they could actually build like a really robust evidence base on actually how can you design a scheme that's effective on these different margins.
I mean, that's a natural place to close, because actually the point that I was going to say that stood out to me from this whole conversation is just that we need to understand more about the underlying drivers of the population health and what's happening to people as a kind of a really important element to designing a kind of system that might support those people. And of course, the issue isn't going away anytime soon. And there are plenty, it seems, of unhappy backbench MPs. So I think it will be an issue that will rumble on and therefore worth getting that evidence together. But for now, let me say thank you very much for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. If you enjoyed the episode, and I hope you did, please subscribe and share the podcast with anyone else who you think might find it interesting. To see more of our work, you can visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. And we look forward to seeing you next time.